Jerusha Alaon, grant of arms, originally from the great kingdom of Atenveldt. In fact, I was one of the founding members of the College of St. Vladimir. Lived out in Arizona for almost 20 years, moved to the Middle Kingdom, Ohio in 2016. And then my husband, Lord Yehoshua Ben Abram, he got a job as a tenured track professor at the College of Southern Nevada in beautiful Las Vegas. So that's how we ended up here in the great barony of Starkhofen in the kingdom of Kaid. But considering that Atenveldt is literally down the street, about an hour and a half away, you know, I still participate in various and sundry things. I got into embroidery. Well, I've always been into embroidery. I dabbled in it during my time in Atenveldt, but I really started to get really involved with it when I moved to the Mid-Realm, because that was me moving from the Phoenix metro area to literally the middle of nowhere. So I had to find something to do with my time, hence the embroidery. So Mistress Elisaid Nihuin is the author of the handout that you hopefully have downloaded. And she's graciously given me permission to teach from it. If you've got materials, great. If not, don't worry about it. You can certainly just walk along with the class. And of course, at the end, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, emotional outbursts, feel free to give me to shoot me a message on Facebook. I am also hosting an embroidery salon every Saturday. I'm extending that into May. So every Saturday from 11 a.m. Pacific time to 3 p.m. Pacific time, I host my own Zoom embroidery salon. You're welcome to come in and just hang out. I do a short embroidery themed lecture at 11:30, and then after that it's just open, open forum. People work on their projects. If they have questions about particular embroidery topics, we also do talk modern stuff. So it's informal, no garb required. So the handout that you should have gotten is the Embroidery 8-period stitches, written by Mistress Elisaid Nihuin, who is from the Great Kingdom of Atenveldt. Inside the handout is a bunch of information. A lot of it, I'm just going to go over the entire handout briefly, and then we're just going to focus on the 8 stitches. We're going to work on getting those stitches started on your sampler, and then if we have time afterwards, I'll entertain questions. So the first few pages are diagrams of all of the stitches. Once you get back past the last stitch, which is the laid work stitch, then you start going into a couple more advanced techniques like ornoe, long armed cross stitch, herringbone, and buttonhole stitch. Those are part of an embroidery 102 class that I teach. So if you were to take my 102 version of this class, we would kind of go more into depth into those. The next section, which is I think the most beautiful part of this handout, and why I don't bother writing my own, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is a summary by century. Basically, Mistress Elisaid breaks down by century the types of stitches that were used, what fabrics they were used on, and the types of designs that were used for that period. And she goes from the 4th century, Coptic and Byzantine, all the way down to 17th century, which is a little bit out of our period, but really begins the renaissance of embroidery technique in terms of research and study and whatnot. The next page is a short essay with general tips written by Mistress Elisaid. I go through some of these tips during my class, but by no means is this an exhaustive list of any sort. And feel free to read it, and if you have any questions about it, I can answer them for you, or you can contact me. And then the last page is a list of suggested reading and websites. The websites feature the Anglo-Saxon and Viking works of the needle by Mistress Thora Sharptooth and the Atlantea's Embroidery Guild. Now, many kingdoms, especially out in the middle and eastern coast of the country, do have embroidery guilds. Atlantea is one of them. East Kingdom has a guild called the Athena's Thimble. Right as I was getting ready to leave the Mid-Realm, the Honorable Company of Embroiderers of the Kingdom of Mid-Realm was being established. And I do believe out here on the west, there is a guild in the Barony of Calafia, which is San Diego area, dedicated to needlework. All of the books here are pretty easy to get. In fact, I actually own every single one of these books. And if we have time at the end of the class, I'll do a little show and tell. But most of these books can be purchased from Amazon relatively inexpensively, except for the Lanto Singe book, Art of Embroidery. That's probably the most expensive book and the most difficult to find. So with that being said, so that's a handout. We're going to go back in here to the first page. Now, before we get started, if you're going to be following along here, you should have gotten, the instructions said that you should have gotten a hoop, no more than 6 inches. This is a slightly smaller hoop. And then there's, and it has a design for your sampler. Now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that way you guys can see a much clearer copy of the sampler. So go ahead and take a moment to put together that pattern on your hoop. While you're doing that, I'll go over some of the basic supplies for embroidery. Obviously, the obvious things that you're going to need besides a needle, besides a hoop and fabric, is of course needles and thread and snips. Snips you can get anywhere really. I buy these in bulk from Amazon. And if you were to take my class at an event, you would have the opportunity to keep your kit by paying me $5, and this is what it pays for. That's what you're paying for, basically, the barrier snips. Everything else I've sourced through various and sundry means. A needle threader is not a requirement, but if you've got bad eyes like me, this is probably a good idea. Now, as far as embroidery thread, the thread that I mentioned in my take-home instructions was cotton floss 6-strand, the most common brand in the United States being DMC, but there's other brands as well. You can get those from pretty much any craft store. This is a full 6 strands of cotton floss. For purposes of our sampler, you'll want to break this down into 2 strands. My method of pulling strands from Dmc Floss is you take the strand and you run it through your fingers a couple of times. This unstraightens the twist. And then once you do that, you locate the thread that you want to pull out one at a time, like so. You place your finger on the thread, your thumbs are holding the other threads down, and you just pull it right through. And then that keeps your thread nice and threaded tight. Now, for purposes of this class, because you know there's only a limited amount of time, I already have some pre-threaded thread because I'm cool like that. Woo. Okay. So what I've done here, this is a regular sharp needle. Generally in needlework, you work with 2 types of needles. These are the sharpened ones and that are usually your crewel needles, or you can also work with blunted needles, which are known as mostly tapestry needles. I prefer working with sharp regardless because I like to know where my needle's going. Now, as far as knotting up your thread, there's various methods and ways to knot your thread up, but I just do the little, tie it twice and then slip the end. So that's my thread. Now, it's very important when you're threading up your needle to limit the amount of thread that you're using. You don't want to get much bigger than the size of your forearm. The medieval term for this is eln, E-L-N. And the reason for that is that the longer you make your thread, the more times you pull it through the fabric, the more it frays and the less shiny it gets, especially towards the end of your thread. Now, for purposes of this class, it doesn't really matter because this is a sampler, but if you're working on a nice piece that you want to keep nice and crisp, then you want to pay attention to the length of your thread.
Question.
Yes.
Do we pull it through to where it's at the halfway point so we have 4 strands that we tie a knot, or do we do it some other way?
Well, this is folded. This is two elms tied in a strand. You can also do like, you know, pull 2 strands and then knot the ends like that. It really doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you do it.
So I'm just wondering if I'm supposed to have 2 strands coming out or 4.
Oh, for this class, 2 strands. 2 strands. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. Yes. So for purposes of this, you're going to do all of the stitches will be done using 2 strands. Once we get into the couched work, you'll be using a full 6 strand, which is why I recommended a larger needle.
When you're talking about how many strands to use, is there a difference with how many strands to use depending on the project? Because
yeah.
I've never really wrapped my head around that.
Yeah, it really depends on your project, what kind of effect you want it, what kind of texture, and sometimes speed is a factor. So for example, when I'm trying to fill up a larger area relatively quickly, I have to use more strands, either 4 or 6, sometimes 8, depending on what I'm trying to achieve. But if I want to do really fine detail work, I'll use a single strand. But again, it really just depends on your piece and what you're trying to achieve. So the first stitch that is on our handout is the stem stitch or outline stitch. You will find that this stitch is in pretty much every single extant piece. So it's a really versatile stitch. You can use it to fill. You can use it to outline. It is found in everything from 4th century Coptic tunics all the way over to modern embroidery work. So it's very much a foundational stitch. It can be used on straight lines or on curves. It really just depends on what you want to use it for. And for purposes of this class, we're going to go ahead and use one of the curve lines in our sampler to go ahead and practice this stitch. So first I'm going to go ahead and do the stitch on screen, and then you can follow along. Now we're going to go through these stitches rather quickly. Typically when I teach this class, it's a 2-hour class, but because we had such popularity with this collegium, I'm trying to run through these stitches in an hour. So I may be going a little bit faster than usual, but please keep in mind, if you want additional help or if you need more assistance, I am always available online. So to start, you're going to bring your needle out at whatever end of the pattern that you want, and then you're going to bring your thread all the way out so that the knot is in the back. Now, a note about the back of embroidery. A lot of people harp on the back of your embroidery being neat, making sure that there's no stray threads or anything of that sort. That is a Victorian convention. The Victorians really cared about that. Folks in our period couldn't care less. If you were to look at the back of the Bayeux tapestry, which is one of the largest pieces of embroidery that survives from our period, if you look at the back of that sucker, it looks like a rat's nest. Nobody, they went zigzagging everywhere, hither and on. So if your back doesn't look like pristine neat, don't worry about it. It's not something that that folks from our period are worried about. Anyway, so you've got your thread through, and then you're going to bring your thread back down. Now, for purposes of this class, I'm going to make my stitches much larger, just so that you guys can see what I'm doing. But really, the size of your stitch is entirely dependent, just like anything else, on the type of project you want to do and the texture and the style that you want to recreate. Smaller stitches, though, do help, are better if you want to do nice curves. The smaller the stitch, the better. But anyway, we're going to pull our thread. Okay, so I'm going to bring my thread in and then bring it all the way back until I have a small loop. Now, I'm exaggerating. Now here is where you can decide where you want to put your needle back out. Now, the conventional way of doing it is to bring your needle back out as close to the front as possible. Not quite the same hole, but close. You can go a little bit further towards the middle if you want. It doesn't matter, but you know, whatever floats your boat. For this example, I'm going to bring my needle out. Now the next decision you have to make is what side of the thread is my stitch gonna go through? Is my needle gonna go above the thread or under the thread? And again, that's a aesthetic choice. If you're working on curves, you typically want to follow the curve to make it look better. The one thing that is important though is that you are consistent with the side of the thread you put your stitch on. Because if you do it like, you know, every other one is a different one, it does make your embroidery look a little cattywampus. So I'm going to use it on the top of the thread, and then I'm going to pull my needle through until it's taut, and then bring my needle back down about the equal length. You know, keeping your stitches even is also another important thing about all of your stitches, really. But this makes it so that it looks uniform and you get that nice little twirl like you see in your outline. So I'm going to do it one more time. Bring my needle through and create my little loop. There we go. And then bring my needle back out and like so. So go ahead and work on that stitch for a few moments. While you're doing that, I will show you. So this is when I take this class, my teacher's hoop is obviously bigger and I use yarn. So this is what a completed stem stitch looks like. And you notice how I started it big, and then as we got into the curve, I chose to go towards the curve, like so. So that is stem stitch. If there are no questions, we're going to move on to our next stitch, which is the split stitch. Again, this is one of those foundational stitches that has been used for thousands of years. It is seen in absolutely every time period in absolutely any way possible. It can be used on both straight lines and curved lines. It can be fill or outline. It's really the most commonly used stitch in surface embroidery, and about 85 to 90% of the work I do is in split stitch. So for this stitch, we're going to use one of the straight lines to work on this stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the stitch. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to put my needle through the end of the line and bring it all the way out. Again, for purposes of this class, I am doing an exaggeratedly long stitch, but for this type of stitch, the smaller the stitch, the better coverage you get. Especially if you're working with two threads or one thread. If you're using larger threads or more of them, 4 threads, 6 thread, 8 thread, you can be a little bit more bigger on your stitches. But if you're using this as a fill stitch, the smaller the stitch, the better. So you're gonna bring your needle through, and then all the way till your thread rests, like so. And then here comes the split part. You're gonna bring your needle through in between. I almost got it. In between the two threads. Or if it's a single strand, you're going to pierce the middle of the strand so that your needle has thread both above it and below it. As to where you want to put your needle out, I have it here in the middle of my stitch, but you can do it further to the front or further to the back. But again, it's important that whenever you're doing a stitch, pick a method and then stick with it, because that will help with the uniformity of your piece. So once I've split the thread with my needle, I pull it through like so, and then we begin again. So we put our needle through, and then split the stitch, or split the thread, and like so. For purposes of, so this is split stitch on a bigger yarn so that you can see what it looks like a little bit better. And as you can see, it kind of has, if it's done well and evenly, it does provide great coverage for your line or your fill if you're wanting to, you know, use it as such.
Can I ask a question about stem stitch?
Sure, go ahead.
So I was practicing this one because I've always struggled with this. Would you, like, you said to stay consistent on which side you bring your needle up. Are there instances where you would like switch back and forth? Because I noticed when I went over the top of a curve, it looks a little spiky, but when I go under the curve, it's nice and smooth.
When you, you want to stay consistent on which side of the thread. For straight lines, when you get to the curve, it always looks better if you go under the curve. So if you've got a lot of curves in your stitching where you have to go up and down and up and down, start with the under, and then use that to go down, and then right around as you start seeing the curve, switch it so that it's up so that you can go up. When you decide to make that switch is up to you, but I would say you probably want to do it right as it starts to look like the curve is going to get spiky. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so next up in our handout is running and double running stitch, which is basically used in a lot of counted thread types of embroidery, your black work, your a CC work, your bargellos, that sort of thing. Another name for it is Holbein stitch, and basically what this is strictly an outline stitch. It's also a basic sewing stitch if you think about it, because of the way the double running part anyway. Because it can be used to put your fabric, you know, to sew two pieces of fabric together. So for this one, it's obviously not a good choice for curves, but you know, whatever. So we're going to use one of the straight lines to practice the stitch, and this one is really easy. So basically, you just bring your needle through, and then you just bring it back down. The key to this stitch working well is making sure that you keep your stitches even. So you bring it up and down. Now for this one, I'm going to go all the way across. So this part right here by itself is just running stitch.
Right.
Okay. Now the double running stitch means that you're going to come back and fill those blank spots that you see on this line here. So, all right, I've got my running stitch here. So basically, to make it double, you just bring your needle back through as close as you can to where the other stitch ends. If you can, try and put it in the exact same area, but if you can't, as close as you can. So, and then you just basically going back the way you came. Keep in mind I'm doing this backwards and in high heels. So, so this is, in theory, if you do this correctly, it should look like just one straight line with like little indentations every so often. Of course, you know, practice does make perfect in this sort of thing. And ta-da! Let me show it to you on a Oh, so this line right here is my running and double running stitch on this sampler right here. So any questions on this one? So now that I'm approaching the end of my thread, a lot of times people ask me, so what do you do to secure your thread? There's a bunch of different ways of doing it. However, the most common is basically taking your needle and going over and just whipping your thread around a couple of your stitches a couple of times, like so, and then cutting off the end. You want to make sure that you do it for enough stitches so that there's no chance for it to unravel. And different types of threads require different amounts of stitches. So for example, for the cotton floss, if I wrap this out a couple more times, it should be fine. For a crewel wool thread, it'll only take a couple because wool sticks to everything. For more satiny, like rayon threads, or even some of the slippery silk threads, you'll want to make sure that you really maybe even tie a little knot around it with your thread just to make sure that it stays put. But really that's how I do it. And then starting back up again, there's a bunch of different ways to start back up again, but usually what I do, and again, let's pretend that this is a thread that's a new thread. I just go back around and start from where I left off. Any questions on that?
I'm sorry, you said about crewel wool? I'm not sure what that
Crewel
is.
wool, it's a type of wool thread. You can embroider with basically any type of thread. I was just speaking to the fact that the type of thread you have determines how much you want to secure it in the back so that it doesn't unravel. The next stitch that I want to talk about is chain stitch. Again, this stitch here can be used for multiple purposes as well. It can be used as both a fill and an outline stitch. It's used, I see it used a lot in decorative, in seam treatments for Viking clothing and vine work for same. So you can also use this to fill an area, and you can also use this in conjunction with satin stitch to create a raised effect. And when we get to the satin stitch portion, I'll show you what I mean by that. There is also an illustration of that in the next page. So for chain stitch, we're going to go ahead and use the second curve on your sampler to do the chain stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how this works. So we're going to bring our needle through the end. And in this situation, you want to bring your needle back down right about where you brought your needle back out again. In this example, you probably want to be as close to it as possible, but if you miss it by like a couple of strands, it's not a big deal. And then you bring down your needle till you create a loop like so. And then from here, you get to make a couple of decisions. The smaller the chain stitch, the better in terms for coverage, if you're using this to cover an area. If you're looking to use it as a fill, as an outline to kind of show, show floof or dimension, you can make your loop a little bit, wider and fluffier, more leaf-like. For purposes of this class, I'm going to make my chain a little bit bigger, just so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So once you've determined what you want to do in terms of your loop, you're going to bring your needle up so that it's inside the thread, like so. Okay? So once you've done that, you pull it back out. And then you bring it back in like you did before to create your next loop. And then as you can see, your next loop holds the previous loop in place, like so. So where you bring your needle up is that's where the direction of your your chain goes. So for an example here, notice how I brought my needle down towards the other side of the curve. And so that's kind of creating that chain stitch curve. Is that how you create curves in chain stitch? So I'm going to let you guys practice that for just a moment while I get myself a new some new thread. If anyone has any questions, now is a good time.
How do you end the chain stitch once you're done?
You just couch it down. Like, so what I did here, basically I instead of going into the next stitch, I couched it down and then just did my little twirly trick. And then if you need to continue, this would be the starting point for your next chain stitch. You would just keep going.
Okay, I get it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So next on our little journey of stitches, surface couching and underside couching. So these stitches are, this technique is used a lot in opus anglicanum, ornoe, and in the and then the bio tapestry to cover area or do outlines. The difference between the two is for surface couching, you are able to see the thread that's being couched, and that's used a lot in ornoe. The underside couching was used mostly in opus anglicanum, and that was basically done to stitch down the gold. And the couching thread was not as important as the actual gold itself. So this is where you get to take a piece of 6-strand cotton. This is going to be we're going to pretend that this is gold thread. And then you're going to go ahead and take this and stitch it down. So this is, so just so you guys know, this is a tapestry needle. It's blunted and it's rather large, and it's got a large eye, and this is used for cross stitch and other, you know, modern types of embroidery. But as you can see, it's a blunt edge. So I'm going to use this to pin down my couching thread here. So for this particular thread, for this particular stitch, we're going to use the last line. We're going to bring our thread through to cover the entire line, and then just kind of leave it loose. Leaving it loose is important. You only want a small end to hang out from one side, like so, and then leave the other end as loose as possible. So for surface couching, you're basically tacking down the thread to the fabric by making short stitches around the couched thread, like so.
Oh, okay.
So basically, this was used, or no, in ornoe, you could use the couching thread to create designs within your gold thread, and so that's how ornoe is primarily used. Now for underside couching. Underside couching basically means that you're pulling this thread should not be seen. So in order to do that, you need to bring your needle down exactly where you brought it out. And for this part, I gotta look and see what I'm doing here. So as you can see, your needle and your thread should be coming in and out of the same place. Once you bring your needle through, then you do a little, tug. Boop. See how that thread is no longer there? And I'm going to show you what it looks like on the back. You see that the thread And so that's why you want to keep this loose, because then you can bring it taut and go to the next one. So you're going to go through here. Like so. Make sure that your thread, that your couching thread is done right, and then this one isn't as successful, as you can tell, because I didn't quite bring the needle back down exactly where I put it out. But there you go. That's the those are the basics of surface and underside couching. Let me show you here on my big sampler how that looks like. So these are the surface couching, and then the underside right here. Brick stitch or long and short stitch. These are done mostly for fill. The modern technique that's used in these days is called thread painting. The long and short stitch is the basis for that particular modern technique. Long and short stitch is also used in counted work. The most period example that I can think of off the top of my head is a German brick stitch, which you use doing long and short stitches to resemble, of course, brick. To practice the stitch, we're going to go ahead and use the square with the lines on it. So the long and short stitch only happen at the beginning of your section, because basically what you're doing, sorry, that, okay, there we go. So basically what you're doing is you're bringing your needle up and down. So this would be considered your long stitch right here. And then bring your needle back up to the square, to that line there, and it's a guideline. And then that would be your short stitch. Now I'm purposely spreading these out so that you can see what I'm doing, but in theory, these stitches would be nestled right next to each other. To kind of show you what that looks like in the sampler, this is what it kind of looks like right here. Now, long and short, when you're doing long and short stitch, if you want it to look more uniform than not, I would recommend adding the guidelines to whatever section you're going to be stitching in the direction you want your threads to go. If you're doing just, you know, more organic long and short stitch to say, to emulate, like, say, feathers or fur, then the guidelines aren't as necessary, and you can be a little bit more, you know, organic in your stitching. Any questions on this?
Yeah, so you rotate long, short, long, short, long, short. And
For the first section. After that, the stitches are the same, because they are the same size, because you're basically going, if you notice here, the second row, it's a little hard to see, I apologize, but you're basically starting your next stitch where the other one ended, and they're the same size, but because the first row is long and short, it creates that brick effect. Satin stitch. I'm not going to spend too much time on satin stitch. In fact, I'm just going to show it to you on the pattern here. Satin stitch is a fill stitch that is basically used to create a smooth texture. I do want to point out there is a diagram showing a row of chain stitches being covered over by a satin. This creates a texture, a kind of an elevated texture, and can be used in conjunction with chain stitch. You can also use this with straight stitches instead. It just really depends on how much you want the elevated effect to be. Using crewel thread, which is what I'm using here, as you can see, I don't even have to do a lot in terms of stitching because it's already kind of, you know, thick. But if you're trying to create an elevated effect with, like, say, thin cotton or silk, then the technique listed on the handout using the chain stitch might be something you want to consider. The final stitch on here is bayou stitch or laid work. I'm going to briefly go over this stitch because it is one of the most famous stitches of our SCA period. Obviously here, who hasn't heard of the bayou tapestry? So I just want to make sure that I cover this stitch, and we're at 10 minutes till class is over, so I'm just going to do this real quick like. So basically the idea is that you want to make sure that you're using as much of the fabric as possible in the front of the fabric. So to create your couching stitches, you bring your thread up and down in a zigzag pattern like the handout is showing you. And I'm just gonna show that like that, and see, this is how it looks like in the back.
Oh.
See, notice how all of the majority of your thread is at the front.
Mm-hmm.
That's a technique that was used in period because thread was a commodity, was a rare commodity. Then you go, so you go up your square and you fill it up with all of these stitches to do your couching, to couch them. And then you're on the opposite end, you bring your stitch down and then couch them over using the surface couching method. So on my finished or not my finished sampler, but on the sampler that I see here. So if you see what I've done here, I've created that's the back, and I've created the couching as such. Does anyone have any other questions?
What did you call that last stitch in the leftmost box?
This one right here? Or this one right here?
Yeah.
It's called bayou stitch or laid work. It's mostly called bayou stitch because it was the main stitch used in the bayou tapestry.
Okay.
But it's also known as laid work because it's not just used in the bayou stitch. It's in the bayou tapestry. It's used in a lot of other types of embroidery. Thank you so much, and you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.